Yo, it's Marco Cattaneo again, subject coordinator for ITI 597, and a subject that covers service management according to ITIL's good practices. Hey, in this topic, I'm going to talk about the 7 R's of change management. Okay, the 7 R's of change management. Now, before I start to talk about like the 7 R's of change management, you need to understand that there's no change in the world that comes without some type of risk associated to it. So for example, if like there's a virus out there and say I'm going to install a server, then of course there's a probability that my server will be hit by that new virus and everything will go down. Now, what's the impact if that occurs? That's the whole thing, okay? So risk is like a function of the two. Risk is a function of like the impact and the probability of something like a threat or a positive opportunity actually occurring. Now, of course, if I install like an up-to-date virus scanner on my server, the probability that, for example, I will be hit by a virus will become smaller. So in other words, I can start to manage my risks. And that is something you should always do, absolutely always, when you're, for example, looking at like making changes and when you're assessing your changes. So risk is a vital part, a key part of the process change management. Now, before I start to introduce the 7 R's of change management, I think it's appropriate, probably even more appropriate so, to introduce the 7 P's of change management. So here we go. Proper prior planning prevents a poor performance, okay? So proper prior planning prevents a poor performance. And you've got a picture here of like it's called Manneke Pies. And this guy actually is, well, he's from Belgium, and it's a very famous statue in Belgium, okay? So it's all about if I do proper planning beforehand, then less things will go wrong if I actually start to take all the actions and make the changes. We need to plan properly. Because otherwise, before you know it, this guy called Murphy will step into your room. And you don't want Murphy to step into your room. Because hopefully you know Murphy's law. If things can go wrong, they will go wrong. To assess or not to assess? That is not the question. Because there is no question. You will always have to assess your changes. You need to understand the impact on the business, on the technology, on the finance. You need to understand the risks. You need to understand the dependencies of this change with the other changes. So there is no doubt about like should we assess or not. You must assess your changes. Very high level and the workflow within change management. You're actually receiving your changes. You need to record them properly. And you will be filtering out like the unfeasible, unrealistic ones. Now, once you've got your changes recorded, they need to be assessed. So you need to get the right information from the right people on whether or not to give the change a go or a no-go. So if you give the change a no-go, it becomes rejected. And of course you need to give like the requester or the initiator proper feedback on like why you can't go ahead with their requested change. If the change is approved, then you need to control it. You need to schedule the change, and it needs to like someone needs to build it, someone needs to test it, someone needs to deploy it. Well, that someone is typically not change management, but becomes release and deployment management. So change management are not the doers. It's release management actually doing the work. So they pick up the work packages and they start to build, test and deploy the so-called releases and release units. Okay. Once the change is like implemented, of course it needs to be reviewed. Did we actually meet the success criteria, yes or no? If you've met the success criteria, you can then close the change. If you haven't, well then typically you have to go back into the change management process to fix it. So that's very high level, like the workflow. Again, whether or not to assess a change, that is not a question. You must assess all changes. Now finally, we're getting to the 7 R's of change management. Because when you're assessing changes, it makes sense to ask a whole bunch of questions and actually to get the answers. So for example, who raised the change? Who's the initiator? Is the initiator actually like authorized to raise changes? What is the reason? What's the business case for the change? What is the return required from the change? Or what are we getting back? What are the risks of like making the change and what are the risks of like not making the change? What resources do we need to implement, but also to support and maintain, for example, the changed environments afterwards? Who is responsible? Who is actually going to build? and test and implement the change. And what are the relationship, for example, between this change and other changes we're working on at the same time? So what are the dependencies between them? So you've got a whole bunch of questions that I think should always be answered if you're assessing your changes. And they are known as the 7 R's of change management. Now, of course, assessing changes takes time. Especially like major changes, you need lots of time to understand like the pros and cons of like making the change, going ahead with the change. So make sure that you build in enough lead time that is appropriate and adequate to the size of the change. Minor changes may need less lead time than major changes, but you need enough time to do a proper assessment. Well, normal changes are normally assessed by the so-called CAB, and a change advisory board, which may come together like once a week, once a fortnight. Emergency changes may not always have the luxury of having enough time to do a proper and full assessment. So that's where you get something like an ECAP, an emergency change advisory board, and they will actually like advise the change manager and advise the change management process on whether or not to give the emergency change a go. Chew, Muskie! Practice what you preach. Yeah, another one. Hey, a request for change, an RFC, just arrived on your desk. Now, it seems that someone out there wants like a major update of the network operating system and the NOS. All 120 routers are affected. So, what questions should you be asking before you go like, okay, let's upgrade all those routers? Okay, so what questions should you be asking that are related to this specific change? Have fun. Chew, Muskie. A simple question. Which one of the following statements is incorrect considering the concept of the 7 R's of change management? Hey, answer A. The 7 R's apply to all changes. Answer B. Once the change is approved, the 7 R's should be answered. Answer C. All changes should be given enough lead time so they can be properly assessed. And answer D. The risk associated with a change is a function of impact and probability. I'll give you a couple of seconds to think about the answer, and then as usual, we move on. Okay, so what's the answer? The answer is answer B. Once the change is approved, the 7 R's should be answered? No, the 7 R's should be answered before you actually approve a change. Okay, so answer B is absolutely the incorrect one. So what's the next topic? Hey, the next topic we're going to define and explain the concept of an event. Okay. Hey, until then, live long and prosper. Nano, nano, and as always, I'll be back.